Picture this. You're sitting in Apple's legendary design studio in Cupertino, California, the same room where Steve Jobs and Jony Ive revolutionized consumer technology. The walls are pristine white, the lighting is perfect, and scattered across the massive table are prototypes representing millions of dollars in research and development. Senior designers with decades of experience are gathered around, examining mock-ups and debating details that most people would never notice. And at the head of the table, presenting the design concept that will become Apple's next flagship product, stands a 14-year-old kid from Brooklyn, who 6 months ago was just another teenager sketching phone designs in his notebook during algebra class. This is the impossible story of Jordan Chen, an 8th grader whose obsessive redesign of the iPhone started as a YouTube hobby and ended with Apple's design team scrambling to incorporate his innovations into their next product launch. In 18 months, Jordan went from anonymous middle school student to the youngest person ever to influence Apple's product design, and he did it by seeing what hundreds of professional designers had somehow missed. But how does a kid with no formal design training, no industry connections, and no access to Apple's resources create concepts so compelling that the world's most valuable company abandons years of their own work to pursue his vision? How does someone who's never held a professional design job convince executives worth billions that they've been thinking about smartphones wrong? The answer lies in understanding that sometimes the freshest innovations come from minds that haven't learned what's supposedly impossible. Jordan's story doesn't begin with any extraordinary privileges or special opportunities. It starts in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, where a 12-year-old boy was doing something that millions of kids do every day. He was complaining about his phone. "My iPhone kept freezing, the battery died by noon, and I was always accidentally touching stuff on the screen I didn't mean to touch," Jordan recalls. "I told my dad that if I designed phones I would fix all these stupid problems. He said so design one as a joke. I took it seriously." What began as a middle school student's frustrated doodling evolved into something far more significant. Jordan started spending his free time sketching phone designs that addressed the practical problems he experienced daily. His early concepts were crude and technically impossible, but they showed something important. Jordan was thinking about smartphones from a user's perspective rather than an engineer's specifications. Jordan's first sketches were hilariously impractical, remembers his father David Chen, a graphic designer who worked in advertising. He drew phones with screens that wrapped around the entire device, batteries that charged from body heat, and interfaces that read your mind. But even those crazy ideas showed he was thinking creatively about solving real problems. David recognized that his son had an intuitive understanding of design principles that typically required years of training to develop. Jordan naturally understood concepts like visual hierarchy, user flow, and intuitive interaction, the invisible architecture that separates good design from bad design. Most parents would have praised their child's creativity and moved on. David did something different. He started teaching Jordan professional design tools and techniques that could transform his imaginative concepts into realistic proposals. Jordan spent the summer before 8th grade learning Sketch, Figma, and other professional design software that companies like Apple use to develop their products. His learning process was intensive and unconventional. YouTube tutorials, online courses, and constant practice created skills that normally required formal education to acquire. But Jordan's most important education came from something simpler. He became obsessed with understanding why phones were designed the way they were. He dismantled old iPhones to understand their internal architecture, studied patent filings to learn about technical constraints, and analyzed every design decision Apple had made over 15 generations of iPhone development. Jordan approached phone design like he was trying to solve a mystery, David explains. He wanted to understand not just what phones looked like but why they looked that way. He was trying to understand the thinking behind every design decision. This investigative approach led Jordan to a crucial realization. Many iPhone design decisions were based on technical limitations that no longer existed or user assumptions that were no longer accurate. Apple's designers were brilliant, but they were sometimes constrained by historical decisions and internal politics that prevented them from reconsidering fundamental assumptions. Jordan's breakthrough came when he stopped trying to design a better iPhone and started imagining what phones could be if designers weren't limited by Apple's existing design language and engineering conventions. His concept, which he called iPhone Reimagined, challenged nearly every assumption about smartphone design that Apple had established over 15 years. The home button was gone, not replaced by gestures like Apple had done, but by context-aware interfaces that adapted to what users were actually trying to do. The screen didn't just display information, it became a dynamic surface that changed texture and responsiveness based on what you were touching. The camera bump that had plagued iPhone designs for years disappeared through optical innovations that Apple's engineers had dismissed as impractical. Most remarkably, Jordan's design concepts addressed problems that users experience daily, but that Apple's designers seem to have stopped noticing: accidental touches, battery anxiety, notification overload, and the dozen small frustrations that accumulated through regular phone usage. Jordan's designs weren't just pretty, they were smarter, observes Dr. Lisa Rodriguez, a user experience researcher who later studied Jordan's concepts. He had identified friction points in iPhone usage that Apple's designers had either overlooked or accepted as unavoidable. His solutions weren't just aesthetic improvements, they were genuine innovations in how humans interact with mobile technology. Jordan documented his entire design process through YouTube videos that he started posting during the fall of 8th grade. The videos showed his thinking process, explained his design decisions, and demonstrated how his concepts would work in real-world usage scenarios. His early videos attracted modest attention from design enthusiasts and iPhone fans who appreciated seeing someone think critically about smartphone design, but Jordan's breakthrough came when his video "Everything Wrong with iPhone Design and How to Fix It" went viral, attracting over 5 million views in 3 days. The video was remarkable for several reasons. Jordan didn't just criticize Apple's design choices, he provided detailed alternatives that demonstrated deep understanding of the engineering, manufacturing, and user experience considerations that professional designers must balance. His concepts weren't fantasy designs that ignored practical constraints, they were thoughtful proposals that addressed real problems within realistic technical limitations. More importantly, Jordan's age and genuine enthusiasm made complex design concepts accessible to general audiences who normally didn't pay attention to the technical aspects of smartphone development. He explained design principles with clarity and passion that made people care about details they had never considered important. Jordan made design approachable, explains Marcus Johnson, a technology journalist who covered Jordan's emergence. He wasn't using industry jargon or talking down to his audience. He was genuinely excited about making phones better, and that enthusiasm was infectious. The viral success of Jordan's video attracted attention from design professionals, technology journalists, and eventually, though indirectly, from people who worked at Apple. Sarah Park, a senior designer at Apple who had worked on several iPhone generations, saw Jordan's video through a colleague who had been impressed by the concepts. Her reaction was mixed. Impressed by Jordan's creativity and insight, but also defensive about the criticisms of designs she had helped create. "My first response was typical designer ego. Who is this kid to criticize work that our team spent years perfecting?" Sarah recalls. But as I watched more of his videos and studied his concepts, I realized he was identifying real problems that we had stopped seeing because we were too close to the product. Sarah wasn't alone in her reaction. Throughout Apple's design organization, people were discovering Jordan's work and having uncomfortable realizations about assumptions they had been making and problems they had been accepting as unsolvable. The conversation reached Jenna Williams, Apple's vice president of product design, who had the authority to actually do something about the insights Jordan was providing. Unlike some executives who might have dismissed criticism from a teenager, Jenna saw Jordan's work as an opportunity to inject fresh thinking into a design process that had become somewhat formulaic. "We had been iterating on the same basic iPhone design for years," Jenna explains. "Each generation was incrementally better, but we weren't fundamentally rethinking how people use phones." Jordan's concept showed us that we had stopped asking big questions because we were focused on solving small problems. Jenna's decision to reach out to Jordan was unprecedented for Apple, a company famous for its secrecy and reluctance to acknowledge outside influences on their design process. But she recognized that Jordan's concepts represented thinking that could genuinely improve Apple's products if they could figure out how to work with a middle school student who had no professional experience or legal capacity to sign contracts. The initial contact came through Jordan's father, with Apple representatives explaining that senior designers wanted to meet with Jordan to discuss his concepts. The family's reaction was disbelief followed by careful skepticism. Was this actually Apple, or some elaborate scam targeting their son's viral success? After verification through multiple channels confirmed that the contact was genuine, Jordan and his father traveled to Cupertino for what was initially described as an informal conversation about design philosophy and user experience concepts. What happened during that first meeting became legendary within Apple's design organization. Jordan arrived at Apple's headquarters nervous but prepared, carrying printed copies of his design concepts and prepared to defend every decision he had made. The meeting was scheduled for 1 hour with 3 senior designers, who wanted to understand Jordan's thinking process. 4 hours later, the meeting was still going, and the conference room had filled with additional designers, engineers, and executives who had heard about the 14-year-old who was making their team reconsider fundamental assumptions about iPhone design. Jordan wasn't intimidated by the audience or the setting, recalls Michael Torres, a senior industrial designer who attended the meeting. He defended his concepts with reasoning that was sometimes more sophisticated than what we used internally. When we explained technical constraints that made certain ideas impractical, he would immediately suggest alternatives that addressed those limitations. He was thinking like a professional designer, not a fan presenting wish lists. The turning point came when Jordan demonstrated his solution to one of Apple's most persistent design challenges: how to increase battery life without making phones thicker or heavier. His approach involved rethinking power management at the software level, implementing intelligent power budgeting that would limit background processes based on user behavior patterns, and using machine learning to predict power needs throughout the day. Apple's engineers had been working on similar concepts, but Jordan's proposal included user interface innovations that made the power management system transparent and intuitive rather than hidden and automatic. Users would understand why their phone was making power decisions and could override the system when necessary, addressing the control and transparency that Apple's implementations had been missing. Jordan had solved the user experience problem that our engineers had been struggling with for months, Jenna explains. His solution wasn't just technically feasible, it was elegant and user-friendly in ways that our internal designs hadn't achieved. By the end of the meeting, Apple's design team had reached an uncomfortable conclusion. A 14-year-old YouTuber had identified genuine opportunities for innovation that their professional team had missed, and his concepts deserved serious consideration for future iPhone development. What followed was months of complex negotiations involving Jordan, his parents, lawyers, Apple's legal team, child labor regulations, and educational requirements that had to be balanced with unprecedented design consulting arrangements. The solution that emerged was carefully structured to protect Jordan's interests, while allowing Apple to benefit from his insights. Jordan became a design consultant working limited hours that wouldn't interfere with his education, with compensation structured as future payments that would be available when he reached adulthood. His contributions would be acknowledged internally but wouldn't be publicly attributed to protect both his privacy and Apple's design mystique. Most importantly, Jordan would work with Apple's designers as a collaborator rather than an employee, providing concepts and feedback while learning from professionals who had been designing industry-leading products for decades. Jordan's first official project with Apple involved redesigning the iPhone's notification system, something that users interacted with constantly, but that had evolved incrementally over many years without fundamental reconsideration. His approach was characteristic of his user-focused design philosophy. Instead of starting with Apple's existing notification system and trying to improve it, Jordan studied how people actually used notifications and what they were trying to accomplish through those interactions. His research, conducted through surveys and interviews with iPhone users across different demographics, revealed something that surprised Apple's design team. Most people weren't trying to stay informed about everything happening on their phones. They were trying to avoid being overwhelmed by constant interruptions while ensuring they didn't miss important information. Jordan identified that notifications had become a problem rather than a solution, explains Dr. Rodriguez, who consulted on the research methodology. Users were anxious about missing important messages, but they were also stressed by constant interruptions. Apple's existing notification system addressed the technical challenge of delivering information, but it hadn't solved the human challenge of managing attention. Jordan's redesigned notification system used context awareness and machine learning to understand which notifications actually mattered to users in different situations. Instead of delivering all notifications with equal urgency, the system created a hierarchy based on user behavior patterns, relationship importance, and situational context. The interface innovations were equally important. Jordan designed notification displays that provided enough information for users to decide whether immediate action was needed without requiring them to open apps or interrupt their current activities. Critical information was immediately accessible, while less urgent notifications were organized for later review. Jordan's notification redesign changed how people interacted with their phones throughout the day, observes Marcus Johnson, who wrote extensively about the evolution of iOS design. It reduced anxiety and interruption while improving users' confidence that they weren't missing important information. It was a genuine quality of life improvement that wouldn't have been possible without rethinking fundamental assumptions. Apple's design team was impressed not just by Jordan's concepts but by his design process and ability to articulate reasoning behind his decisions. He approached design challenges with methodical thinking that considered user needs, technical constraints, business requirements, and aesthetic principles simultaneously. Jordan had an intuitive understanding of the multidimensional complexity of product design. Jenna reflects, he didn't just make things look pretty, he solved problems holistically by considering all the factors that professional designers must balance. Jordan's success with the notification redesign led to expanded involvement in other aspects of iPhone development. He contributed concepts for camera interfaces, home screen organization, settings navigation, and dozens of smaller features that collectively improved the overall user experience. But Jordan's most significant contribution to Apple's design evolution came through his influence on the company's design culture rather than specific product features. His presence in design meetings, his questions about assumptions, and his willingness to challenge established practices created an environment where Apple's designers felt permission to reconsider decisions that had been treated as settled issues. Jordan's age and outsider status made him uniquely able to ask why about things that more experienced designers had stopped questioning. Jordan reminded us to stay curious about our own designs, Sarah Park explains. He would ask why we made certain decisions, and sometimes we realized we didn't have good reasons beyond, that's how we've always done it. His questions forced us to be more thoughtful about every design choice. This cultural influence extended beyond the design team to engineering, product management, and even executive leadership. Jordan's success demonstrated that breakthrough innovations could come from unexpected sources, encouraging Apple to be more receptive to ideas that challenged conventional thinking. Jordan's sophomore year of high school was consumed by balancing academic requirements with his consulting work for Apple. The arrangement required careful management to ensure that his design responsibilities didn't compromise his education or normal teenage development. His school was supportive but cautious, recognizing the extraordinary opportunity while ensuring that Jordan maintained focus on age-appropriate educational and social experiences. Teachers worked with the family to accommodate his schedule while maintaining academic standards. Jordan was living a double life, recalls his English teacher, Mrs. Anderson. In first period, he was just another sophomore analyzing poetry. By third period, he was on video calls with Apple executives discussing product strategy. It was surreal, but Jordan handled the transitions remarkably well. Jordan's classmates were initially impressed by his Apple connection, but the novelty wore off as they realized that Jordan's work commitments limited his availability for normal teenage activities. He couldn't attend every social event, couldn't always hang out after school, and often seemed distracted by design problems he was thinking through. Being a normal teenager and a professional designer at the same time was really hard, Jordan admits. I wanted to hang out with friends and go to parties, but I also had deadlines and meetings with people who were depending on my contributions. Finding balance was probably harder than any design challenge I worked on. The complexity of Jordan's situation required ongoing support from family, school counselors, and eventually professional therapists who specialized in gifted adolescents managing unusual circumstances. His parents were vigilant about ensuring that professional success didn't come at the expense of emotional health and personal development. Jordan's junior year brought new challenges and opportunities. Apple's next iPhone generation would be the first to extensively incorporate design concepts that Jordan had influenced, and the product launch would test whether his user-focused design philosophy would resonate with consumers. The pressure was significant. If the new iPhone succeeded, Jordan's contributions would be validated, and his influence within Apple would grow. If the product disappointed, critics would question whether Apple had been wise to incorporate concepts from a teenage consultant with no formal design credentials. The iPhone 15 launch in September proved to be a turning point for both Apple and Jordan. The device received the most positive reviews of any iPhone in years, with particular praise for user experience improvements that addressed long-standing complaints about notification management, battery life, and interface complexity. The iPhone 15 feels like someone actually thought about how people use their phones, wrote tech journalist Sarah Miller in her review. Small improvements throughout the interface combine to create a device that's noticeably more pleasant to use than previous generations. Apple's sales figures confirm the critical reception, with the iPhone 15 becoming the fastest-selling model in company history. User satisfaction scores reached record highs, and customer feedback specifically mentioned many of the improvements that Jordan had influenced. Jordan's role in the iPhone 15's success couldn't be publicly acknowledged due to his consulting agreement, but within Apple, his contributions were recognized and celebrated. He had proven that his design philosophy wasn't just interesting in concept, it delivered measurable improvements in user satisfaction and commercial success. The success led to expanded responsibilities and new opportunities. Apple invited Jordan to contribute concepts for future product categories beyond smartphones, including tablets, laptops, and wearable devices. His user-focused approach to design was being recognized as valuable across Apple's entire product portfolio. But Jordan's most significant contribution to Apple's future came through his work on what would eventually be announced as the iPhone 16, a device that would represent the most comprehensive redesign since the original iPhone's introduction. Jordan's vision for the iPhone 16 challenged fundamental assumptions about what smartphones should be and how people should interact with mobile technology. His concepts included revolutionary interface paradigms, new interaction methods, and hardware innovations that would require Apple's engineers to develop entirely new technologies. Jordan was proposing that we fundamentally rethink the smartphone, Jenna explains, not just improve the iPhone, but reimagine what phones could be if we weren't constrained by 15 years of accumulated design decisions and user expectations. The iPhone 16 project would test both Jordan's design vision and Apple's willingness to pursue radical innovation. Success would cement Jordan's reputation as a transformative designer, whose influence extended far beyond his age or experience. Failure would raise questions about whether Apple had been too willing to embrace concepts from a teenage consultant who lacked the professional judgment that comes from experience. Jordan's senior year of high school was dominated by the iPhone 16 development process. He worked closely with Apple's design and engineering teams to refine concepts, address technical challenges, and ensure that revolutionary features would be practical and usable for mainstream consumers. The process tested Jordan's design abilities and professional maturity in ways that his earlier consulting work hadn't required. He faced resistance from engineers who questioned whether his concepts were technically feasible, pushback from product managers who worried about user confusion with radical interface changes, and skepticism from executives concerned about commercial risks. Jordan had to learn to defend his ideas while being open to feedback and willing to compromise when necessary, Sarah Park observes. He needed to develop the professional skills that normally take years to acquire, how to advocate for design concepts while collaborating effectively with people who had legitimate concerns about implementation challenges. Jordan's response to these challenges demonstrated maturity that impressed Apple's leadership. He learned to present concepts in ways that addressed stakeholders' concerns, developed alternative approaches when original ideas proved impractical, and built collaborative relationships with engineers and product managers who had initially been skeptical about working with a teenage consultant. The iPhone 16 was announced in September of Jordan's freshman year of college. By that time, he had been working with Apple for 3 years and had contributed to 4 generations of iPhone development. The device was immediately recognized as the most significant iPhone advancement since the original model's introduction. Revolutionary interface concepts that Jordan had pioneered changed how people interacted with their phones, new interaction methods made mobile technology more accessible and intuitive, and hardware innovations established new standards for the entire smartphone industry. The iPhone 16 isn't just a better phone, it's a different category of device, wrote technology analyst Marcus Thompson. Apple has fundamentally rethought what smartphones should be and how people should interact with mobile technology. This is genuine innovation rather than incremental improvement. The commercial and critical success of the iPhone 16 finally allowed Apple to publicly acknowledge Jordan's contributions to their design evolution. In an unprecedented move, Apple's CEO mentioned Jordan during the product announcement, crediting the fresh perspective of a young designer who helped us see our products through users' eyes. The acknowledgement transformed Jordan from anonymous consultant to publicly recognized figure in technology design. Media coverage celebrated the story of a teenager whose YouTube criticisms had evolved into genuine influence on one of the world's most valuable companies. Jordan's response to public recognition reflected his characteristic focus on design outcomes rather than personal celebrity. I'm glad people like the iPhone 16, but this isn't about me. It's about Apple being willing to listen to ideas from someone without traditional credentials and being brave enough to pursue genuine innovation rather than just incremental improvements. Today at 19 years old, Jordan continues his work with Apple while pursuing industrial design studies at MIT. His influence extends far beyond specific iPhone features to include fundamental changes in how Apple approaches product development and design thinking. His story has become a case study in innovation, demonstrating how breakthrough ideas can emerge from unexpected sources when companies are willing to look beyond traditional credentials and established hierarchies. Major corporations across multiple industries have studied Apple's experience working with Jordan to understand how they can better incorporate outside perspectives into their design processes. Educational institutions have examined Jordan's journey to understand how design talent develops and how young people with exceptional abilities can be supported without compromising their overall development. His experience has informed new approaches to design education that emphasize user empathy and practical problem solving alongside technical skill development. Jordan's success wasn't just about his individual talent, observes Dr. Rodriguez, who has studied exceptional achievement in design fields. It was about his user-focused approach to design, his willingness to question assumptions, and Apple's willingness to recognize valuable insights regardless of their source. Jordan's influence on smartphone design continues to expand as other manufacturers adopt concepts he pioneered and as Apple incorporates his design philosophy across their entire product portfolio. His contributions have improved how billions of people interact with technology daily, making devices more intuitive, less stressful, and better aligned with human needs and behaviors. But perhaps Jordan's greatest legacy is demonstrating that meaningful innovation often comes not from having more expertise, but from maintaining fresh perspective and willingness to question established practices. His journey from frustrated iPhone user to influential designer proves that transformative ideas can emerge from anyone who combines creativity, determination, and genuine commitment to solving important problems. The 14-year-old who criticized iPhone design in YouTube videos became a young man whose concepts changed how the world's most valuable company thinks about product development. His story reminds us that breakthrough innovations often come from voices we least expect, and that companies willing to listen to those voices can achieve success that would be impossible through conventional approaches alone. Jordan Chen's legacy extends beyond specific iPhone features to include fundamental insights about design, innovation, and the relationship between user experience and commercial success. His influence continues to shape not just Apple's products, but the entire technology industry's approach to understanding and serving human needs through thoughtful design. The boy who thought he could design a better iPhone proved that sometimes the freshest innovations come from minds that haven't learned what's supposedly impossible, and that companies wise enough to recognize valuable insights regardless of their source can achieve breakthroughs that transform entire industries.